Thanks and good afternoon, everybody. I'll also share a bit of the latest research from the McKinsey Global Institute and McKinsey on this topic, some more recent, some less so. Maybe starting with the one research that we did 4 years ago now, where our McKinsey Global Institute looked at all the jobs that are globally available and deconstructed them in the tasks and activities and looked really at considering existing technology, what portion of these occupations are technically automatable. And some are more automatable, some are less, but the key message here is there's a large number of jobs and occupation that will have a significant degree of change, given many of the tasks will be automated. Building on this research, then we looked at considering the balance of jobs that will be increasing and jobs that will be decreasing in demand. What are the skills needed for the activities that are left in those jobs? And this also started to shed the lights that indeed the technological skill will be more in demand, but there's also a large component of social emotional skills and higher cognitive skills that will be more in demand for, and people will need to spend more time using those skills in their jobs of tomorrow. And so this was a starting point for the latest research, where what we tried to do is to go much deeper in what are these skills that to future-proof future citizens. And the angle we took is not to look at industry-specific knowledge or functional knowledge or specific technological knowledge, but what are those skills that are common across? When we say social-emotional skill, what are those? When we say higher cognitives, what are those? And what portion of the technological skills are really useful for everyone? So we try to really go more granularly so that we could also assess a bit to what extent these skills are present today, and is there already value in those possessing those skills? Do they capture value from having these skills? So we ran this research with 18,000 people across 15 countries, and I'll share a bit on the journey on this research, right? The starting point was creating a bit of a new definition, right? There are soft skills, some people talks about skills, attitude, competencies. So in general, we wanted to move away from this and just say there are elements that create talent. These are, we try to make them as distinct as possible to really get to what are these building blocks that will enable people to continuously learn new ways of working, whatever occupations they'll end up doing and however the occupation is going to change, considering that the world will become more dynamic, more digital, and more automated. And so from those three, if we go back for those three categories, the higher cognitive, social, emotional, and technological skills, we really try to unpack and filter through what are really the building blocks that will enable people to stay relevant, given machines will take more and more activity, or they'll automate more and more activities. What are those specific building blocks that will help people operate successfully in increasingly digital environments? And ultimately, what are the building blocks that will continuously help citizens and people to adapt to continuous change? And we landed on this framework, which we try to build as much as possible in a way that it's distinct, more like thinking of it as a periodic table of elements of talent, as opposed to a fluid, otherwise problem where there's multiple soft skills, attitudes that are interrelated and they build on each other, right? And we try to do this so that we could start creating assessment. It's easier to think of how to structure a program by combining these building blocks. And so the idea was to have something more easy to work with, given the scope of soft skills and transversal skills, however people want to call them, is quite complex. And we stick with this definition of these are the distinct elements of talent. And as you'll see, you recognize there's the cognitive stuff on the top left corner. We have split the social emotional in something that is really about self and self-leadership, which is the bottom left corner, and something that is more about interpersonal leadership, working with others and mobilizing change and system, which is on the top right corner. And then we have tried to carve out what are these basic digital skills or attitudes or basically elements of talent that still people need to have. It's not about being an IT specialist, but even if you're not in IT, you need to have those to be more productive in the society of today and tomorrow. And once we were able to construct this, we started running the research, right? For each of these, we created some research tool to understand what is the proficiency today of the people or adults in the labor market. And just to frame this, we calibrated this as 100 is the ideal situation. You know, it means it doesn't mean that 100 means everyone can code, but 100 means everyone understand how coding and how software works. They don't need to code themselves, but they need to have the understanding of that. They need to have the understanding of the potential of software development and smart systems and so on. So considering 100 is the ideal situation, we have found in general gaps across the board, right? The biggest in digital, although this was run before COVID, so this might have changed now. And then we have found also some gaps in the planning and working with agility as well as in communication. What we also did then is looking at whether there was a link already between having higher proficiency in the variety of these elements of talent and some of the outcomes, be that employment, higher incomes, and job satisfaction. And we saw that for many of them, there was some correlation showing that these are not really only future skills. And many have actually said, what you have in this page was important 20 years ago, was already important 40 years ago. We should call them the durable skills, those that don't really change with time. And also based on these inputs, we really thought of, is there a hierarchy even in this picture, right? And we could see that like there are some elements of talent that are more in the technical skills, right? And indeed, these days, like it's important to understand data analytics, how it works. It's important to have some literacy, but those like will likely change continuously. So in terms of also shelf life of this, like knowing the basic cybersecurity, you know, hackers will keep developing more and more, and we need to keep up to date. So shelf life of the bottom type of elements is kind of shorter. Then there's this middle layer of human skills, and those are the ones that really will increase in importance and as machine automate more and more tasks. And so you have the critical thinking skills here, all the interpersonal skills, and we call them human skills. Those are definitely more long-term and transversal and durable. But we also thought that maybe there's a higher level of hierarchy, because in order to continuously develop interpersonal skills and grow and change, there's something that we call growth elements of talent. And so having the right mental flexibility and the right self-leadership, being open to change, understanding who we are and how, and having the growth mindset to be willing to learn and continuously grow, that's really at the top of the pyramid if we need to think of what's really important, for example, in the education system. And this is a bit where I'm going now. One thing going back, I'd love to, what was interesting is that as we think of the ones that are the deltas that are already more linked to outcomes, you can see that many of these are what we call growth deltas, right? You see self-confidence is here, coping with uncertainty. So all of those are more around the growth delta. So there seem to be also in the data some suggestion that those seems to be indeed at the top of the hierarchy. So moving towards the end of the presentation, sorry, let me get rid of this. I will look into what we found in terms of the link between the proficiency and whether people have completed university or stopped earlier. And so we found that overall, people that have gone further in education had a higher proficiency across the board. There were some elements in particular where the link was quite high, right? So the numbers you see in the little bubbles are how much more predictive power a model has compared to pure chance to predict the proficiency in one of these deltas, knowing whether when a person has stopped its educational path. And so you could see on the right that some had quite a higher correlation, so quite more predictive power. And so we could see that there's a strong link clearly if people went to university to developing these deltas. A couple of them as a negative coefficient. So what was interesting is that inspiring trust and humility seems to actually decline as people go further into their education. What was though probably more interesting and to some extent concerning, and speaking with many education providers, actually they were not surprised that many of these elements you see on the left, they are not really the focus of our education systems today, the majority of our education systems today. And some of these elements you find here, it's coping with uncertainty and self-confidence, is those very growth deltas that are both at the top of the pyramid and also that have a higher link with outcomes. And so it seems that indeed, if we look at the education system and therefore the adults in the world today, what's on the left is likely going to be lacking. And if we think that whether this matters, like what I've done here is I plotted only the elements where education system doesn't seem to be significantly linked to this. And if you think of how much more innovation a country could have if everyone was more creative, imaginative, and courageous risk taker. If you think of how much more productive countries would be if people are able to resolve conflicts quickly, to synthesize messages quickly, to coach others and be decisive and having an ownership mindset. How much more common humanity we would have if everyone was more trustworthy and more empathetic, but also how much every individual would have a higher ability to keep well-being by being more self-confident, humble, comfortable with uncertainty, and maintaining digital ethics in engaging with others. And so I'll close with a couple of reflections on what are some education systems doing to close this gap, to really develop these elements of talent. And so I've seen 4 approaches. The first is creating a complete separate package. It could be a career program, it could be a after-school program where they bundle all of these skills and attitudes, or many of these there. And we say in the traditional educations, we can't do it. It's easier to create something in parallel. The second approach I've seen is creating specific disciplinary subject, focus on some of these. Psychology is one often used because the backbone of psychology helps a lot of the understanding the biases, understanding oneself, understanding how we think, understanding how we can change. And then negotiation is another one that is typically created as a disciplinary course. Then the third approach is really trying to embed all of these or a variety of these elements throughout the program, and crafting specific learning format that work better for specific distinct element of talents. For example, group work is one that oftentimes designed in a certain way can develop many of these, and sometimes bringing in professionals, personal coaches. Some systems have even split the role of a teacher in a coach and a master of knowledge of a specific subject, and they keep the coaching class. They have the master expert working remotely through a hybrid model. And then the fourth one is more around mobilizing students or even employee, in the corporate world, employees in self-development journeys. And the reason here is that much of these elements are changing who we are and how we think. And those really, like, people can impact and change on those if it's themselves wanting to change and choosing to change. And so in that sense, it's providing the right construct, the peer feedback. In school, there's the skill of the week, but things that help people self-develop as opposed to having then being led into the development. And so ultimately at the bottom, like what we're seeing is that having something like a taxonomy that we have shown, like customized for each of the specific program, is very helpful to make sure that there's a systematic way to meta tag where in the programs we are attempting to develop the different elements. And this is still an open field of research, right? So knowing what we are trying to do and being able to measure whether what we're trying to do works or not is also quite helpful to identify, how to best develop these. And I'll stop here, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Marco. Now, before we go to Parcela for questions, I just have one quick question myself. So you mentioned the term education players when you were talking about the ways in which deltas can be developed. Could you clarify that? What do you mean by education players? Are they all levels of the education system, from sort of kindergarten to all life education, or is it universities, or is it something else?
I think it's a combination of all of these, in the sense that I've seen some at the kindergarten level and earlier education years trying to change their programs. I've seen the 12 to 18 so far is where I've seen more attempts at innovation, especially through the hybrid experiments that happened during COVID. But also that includes universities, executive education. So I think any education players playing in this is attempting to, in one way or another, sometimes doesn't have the breadth of what I showed here, but they have clearly identified that for their program, some of the skills on that framework are needed, and they're trying to embed them in the approaches that I've suggested.
Thank you, Marco. Well, we've had a lot of questions come in, so I'll hand over to my colleague Parcela now.
Yes, thank you, Marco, for giving us the framework of 56 deltas. It somehow narrows down where organizations and probably also governments should focus on going forward. And the first question I would like to ask you from Slido, which we have received, is what do you think, can government policies influence any of the 4 categories of deltas, meaning help to improve the citizens' skills in any of these categories?
I think a part of it is just the education system, right? A lot of private education systems are innovating and oftentimes much faster than the public systems, right? So I would say the public system probably would, it would be good if they also start experimenting with different models, both to keep up with the pace of the private sector, and it's difficult to shift the whole system towards a new model. But I think starting to pilot, and some parents will like a model, some parents will like another, but providing that variability even in the public system will help learn more and accelerate the pace of innovation and reduce the gap with the private education systems. For adults, then it's a bit different, right? Because I think when also looking at the previous speech on reskilling, adults have a job, and so it's very important that any of these soft skills or distinct elements of talent that I mentioned are in general embedded on something that gets people into job, or it's very customized for the job that they're doing, right? So in that sense, this is a general framework, but then it's important that it's thinking even in adult learning program, how do these skills manifest into that industry, into that job, and making sure that the programs that are oftentimes funded by the public include a certain version of these skills that is relevant for the job that they are looking at or the industry that they're operating in.
The next question is more about the structure you provided, and what you had this triangle where on the upper part there was those growth deltas, 2 mental flexibility and self-leadership skill areas. And the question is that it seems that those 2 are the most difficult to develop. So how would you suggest to go about them?
A very good question. And the difficulty comes from they can't be taught, right? It's something really that it's about igniting people's reflection, self-awareness, and then having them choose to develop those, right? Look, there's different constructs, right? I think oftentimes with self-confidence, mentorship helps, peer groups help, support groups help, helping someone focus on something they're really good also help. So being good at mastering at least something that you're very good at builds confidence that, I don't need to be good at everything, but at least I have something that I've chosen that I'm very good at, and I develop self-confidence in that space. So that's one example for self-confidence. I think for self-awareness, that is a bit trickier. I've seen a lot trying with the meditation techniques. I've seen a lot of personality tests that at least trigger the thinking. I think also the use of psychology and oftentimes like teaching how the brain works, and the cognitive bias that everyone is more or less open or exposed to also help to reflect and really understand, our brain is a machine that we are not fully in control, right? And so to some extent helps having that self-awareness and understanding also how our own mind works. So I think that's probably the what I would answer that question. But it's probably $1 million question, if not more.
Well, and if you would know the answer, you would probably share it with us as well. Thank you. The next question, which is also, I think, quite interesting, is someone is having their thoughts on the skills and profession, and the question is either the profession as such is the concept to continue with, or maybe what is important is the genuine skill of set of skills.
I'm not sure I fully understand this, but I'll try to give my interpretation, right? It's the balance of how much is about the profession versus taking a pure skill-based approach, right? And the thing is, in adults, it's so to say 2 things. Many of these skills can't really be taught in a vacuum, right? They need to be taught within a certain context. and that context is as relevant as possible to what a person is doing, right? So there's not, I don't see a complete distinction of it's either a skill or it's a profession. In adults, at least, is oftentimes the combination of the two, right? How do you combine some of these delta development into a training which is focused on certain technical skills and activities and knowledge that someone need to learn in order to perform a certain job, right? I don't know if I hope I answered to the right question, but happy to get clarification otherwise.
I think it is clear, and you are right, it is about the combination, right? So you cannot just move them as the concept separately, one from each other. The last question may be a bit more philosophical, but I still decided to ask it as one of the lists. So it seems that the skill required in the future are becoming more complex. Does this mean that life in general is going to be harder?
Complex, it's as we were looking at these skills, it's the reason why when we link to the outcomes, we also looked at job satisfaction, right? We wanted to have something that is not just about income, it's not about employment, it's also about satisfaction, right? Many of these skills are hopefully, and I think it's, again, difficult to prove, but it's skills that help in life in general, also, you know, within the family, on relationships, and therefore, to some extent, I wouldn't say that those are, especially those skills, the complexity, yes, they're complex, but I think they're key for personal growth and for also having a better life outside of work. The technical part, like the digital, I do see indeed that if I think of adults, and to some extent, you know, myself, I'm definitely not as digitally savvy as the generation after me. So I think I can see how all of the digital skills that now we need to understand and engage with, that's probably the added complexity. And I guess it's painful for everyone to have to keep up to the pace of digital progress. But I guess it's something that we probably just have to do if we want to keep as productive as we can be.
Thank you. I think I just, again, got something to take as a note for myself, that we don't learn those skills because we want to be successful at work, but because we want to have a better life. So a very nice way to put it all together. Thank you very much, Marco.